To start today, scholars, we want to talk about purpose. Yes, purpose. You know, the whole why you're here thing. So, last week was a baseline assessment, so I could see how you're going to do on the things that I'm going to plan on doing with you this semester, and also to see how well you can conceptualize or pick up the ideas that are being thrown out. So what I noticed in all of the assessments and throughout all of the lessons is that we really didn't understand the purpose or why we were there for them. And that creates a problem. So like in the OPVL, when we're saying that the purpose of looking at the document is for historians, no, the purpose is for you to use them for your assessment and how they have value and limitation towards your assessment. So that comes to the point that you need to understand, why am I doing this? So anything you're doing in class, you have to know why you're doing it and to what the purpose of being there in class is. And it's not just simply to get the homework done. So let's take a look at the unit. So this is where we have our unit rollout when we go through our MYP unit planners. So what I'm going to put up in front of you is the GRASP. Okay, so what this is our inquiry statement. Government structures are given power by their direct purpose and creation, but also by the evolution of the culture they oversee. So what we're trying to do throughout the end of this unit is give assessment to that statement. Is it true? Is it somewhat true? To what extent is it true? Or is it completely false? In order to do that, we're going to have to do some study. So we have a key concept, and the key concept for this particular piece of the unit, or for the unit as a whole, is time, place, and space. So many of you use the idea that maybe Plato was racist. Well, that might be true. And he was a misogynist, meaning that he didn't respect women. Also might be true. But you have to put it in the context of time, space, and place. He's not living in 2016. He's living in 320 BCE, before Christ. So we have to be able to look at the time, space, and place. But we also have to look at the ideas that we're assessing. Are those ideas actual limitations to him in the way that we're trying to look at his document as far as the structures of government? So again, we have to learn from these ideas and be able to put ideas in time, space, and place. Just because they're old does not make them relevant or untrue. With this, the related concept is power, which we've gone over, and then we get into our GRASP as a whole. So the first part of GRASP is goal. What is your overall goal? What are you trying to achieve? So the goal is, in a document-supported essay, develop a claim as to what extent one form of government provides for the purposes of government over others. So is there one better government out there? Your role. You are a researcher hired by a new forming government. Every day you show up to class, this is your job, is we've hired you, or a forming government has hired you, to advise them. Your job is to do research and then write a paper that they want to use. So you're competing against your rest of your classmates to get your paper read. Your audience, your client is the head of a cabinet trying to create a new government, in that case me. The situation, a new forming government has hired your firm to help them create or advise them on how to create a government that meets the purposes of government and creates the most stable government possible for them. So your job is to research and be able to tell them that. You are in competition with the rest of your class as whose paper will get heard. Think about it as a competitive job, and you want to make the money. Your end product is going to be a document-based essay where you use information from class research that we've looked at in order to create that in document-based essay. What that looks like is all of the assessments that we're doing in class. So you will do a OPVL, a compare and contrast, and then you will write an actual essay. All three of those pieces will be things you'll be assessed on this final assessment. So every week we break it down into smaller parts to practice those pieces, and we look at small pieces of what we're going to want to look at. So last week the ideas were power and the structure of government, which we should understand power and how we get it, the 3 questions of power, and the 4 purposes of government, why government exists. This week we'll have a guiding question, just as we did last week. So everything we're doing this week is to try and answer the guiding question. So if you're looking at documents, the OPVL for them is to answer or look at the value of those documents and limitations for answering that question. So let's take a look at what we'll be doing this week. Okay, so the guiding question that we want to answer this week, or in our final essay for this week, what we'll be looking to answer is one government demonstrably better than another? So the learning target for today and the piece that we want to look at is there are multiple forms of legitimate governments. So the success criterion then is scholars will be able to identify the differences in the power structure of different government forms. The activity, scholars will turn in notes identifying the forms of government and who holds power in them, to what extent, and why they have power. And I'll show you a little outline of what that looks like. And again, you can purchase this assignment for $20 from your bank accounts if you choose to have it graded. So as not to keep you too long, let's take a look at what the note structure is. So one of the forms of government is monarchy and or dictatorship, or government run by one. So what I would break it down to is these general questions. Who has the power? To what extent can they wield it? Why do they have it? And then look at examples of these governments and general notes on it provided in the video or that I might intervene with. Okay, now there's a rubric posted on today's class task that will show you how we'll grade this, but this would be your final assignment for the day, is turning this in for the 5 different forms that they go over in the video. So here we go. Let's take a look at the 5 forms of government.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having 0 power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these 5, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists.
Let me interject for just a moment and let's talk about monarchy. Monarchy comes from the divine right of kings, which means that there's a lineage. And in governments that are monarchies that go back to Christian religion, it's a direct lineage back to Christ, so it's by bloodline. And these bloodlines, depending on the religion, and yes, monarchies are always connected to religion, that's how they get their legitimacy and sometimes their authority. Actually, their legitimacy comes directly from their bloodline, and their authority comes from the church, which is why the Catholic Church was so powerful during the Middle Ages and still today, is because they got to choose who the Western kings were and give them the authority to rule as kings. So the idea of divine right is a nobility passing on of lineage and blood. That's what gave these kings or queens the ability to rule. So it's important to understand the divine right of kings, as that was what ruled for quite some time. And still in other monarchies, it's a blood lineage. Dictatorship, on the other hand, is they come to power by different means, and so then it really depends on how they came to power, but it still can be rule of one. Now, why none of them exist in the sense that one person really rules, the idea and concepts of those governments still exist today.
Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments. So they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the gunman aren't subject to majority rule but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt, because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. In every case, they ended up with mob rule, then anarchy, and finally tyranny under an oligarchy. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon, who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law, and in effect built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets, demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy, and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite.
While this video may have been very poignant and had a very distinctive point and bias, it does show us a lot of good information about the 5 forms of government and looking at governments as a whole. Now, we'll continue to talk about this in class tomorrow, but please make sure that you take your notes, turn them in if you're going to purchase the assignment. They are due before class tomorrow. We will continue on with these notes and look at these different forms of government, but you need to bring this information with you so that we continue to build on it.